Okay, thank you for coming. I'm Susan James, Library Manager here at Bayliss Library, Assistant Director of the Superior District Library. I'd like to thank Dr. James Ted Walker for appearing tonight and his wife for helping out, Nancy. Dr. Walker is a retired professor of humanities who taught for 40 years, 30 of which were at Ferris State University. He's currently teaching as an adjunct professor at Lake Superior State University, from which he earned a degree in history. His graduate degrees are from Western Michigan University and Florida State. One of the delights of summer is Ted's annual humanities talk. This is his 10th annual presentation at Bayliss. Tonight he's speaking about Martin Luther, Rembrandt, and Vermeer, the beginnings of Protestant art. Please welcome back Ted Walker.
Folks, before we get going here, Susan does a fabulous job in bringing people in, treats everybody really well, and there is a great deal of food to be eaten over there that comes to the library. Got that, and it's good to be back. It's good to do this every year, and so we'll get going. For those of you who have been here and listened to some of these talks over the last few years, I have done the stuff that I used to do in my classes all the time. You get to see beautiful art, you get to see the things that Michelangelo did and all that. And so I just thought, just for fun, I would show you a few of these, just for reasons that will become more apparent later. This, of course, is Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, which is very, very hard to get in to see, but it is one of the great works of art. And when you go to a class, it's one of the first ones that the instructor would show. Go ahead, Nancy. And then, of course, you get to see Michelangelo, and you would see this. And once again, if you're teaching anywhere from the University of Michigan all the way out to some school in California, these would be the things that every student who walked into a humanities class or an art history class would see, and they are designed to amaze you, and you marvel at their beauty and the people who made them. Go ahead, Nance. And you see things like this, St. Peter's Cathedral. Is there anybody here who has been to St. Peter's? So if you've been to St. Peter's, you know then that when you walk in, it's just an absolutely astonishing place to go into. That all of the statuary is 18 to 20 feet high, because if it didn't, it would look just way too small in this magnificent building. And in fact, one last of these, and then we'll get to where we're going. One more time, Nancy. This is the interior of it. And it's hard to imagine as you walk up to this altar that this is 70 feet high. There was only one building on the school where I taught that was bigger than the interior of this right here. But there's a dark side to this. And this is something that very rarely do we spend a great deal of time in our classrooms about. These things were extraordinarily expensive to make. Michelangelo didn't work on the cheap. He charged. Leonardo really charged. All of the great artists of the Renaissance that we look at, including Bernini here, who constructed this, they required a huge amount of money in order to do the things that they did. What is oftentimes, because we just don't have time to cover them, is that there were thousands of artists who worked in here. Every single one of them, whether they might be marble cutters or whatever they might be, they had to be paid. So the question then is, where did the money come from? That's the darker side of the story. When St. Peter's was built in the first few years of the 1500s, it was so huge, so much bigger than anything that had been built at the time, that no one really had an idea of how they were going to pay for it. But pretty quickly, it became pretty clear what it was that they intended to do. The Pope who wanted this built was a warrior pope. He had an army. He headed out into the lands outside of Rome. He stole land from anybody that he could take it from, taxed the people that were on it, and that helped pay for some. But keep in mind now that this isn't the only church that they were building. They were building, if you go through Rome, there are dozens and dozens of churches, every one of them, not made quite to this standard, but just costing a whole lot. Great works of art had to be in them. Artists, there were hundreds of artists working in Rome in order to make the center of the Christian world what it was. And of course now people go there as tourists, whether they believe or not, and they walk in and they see these things and they just marvel at what could have been done. But the money part got worse. And you have to understand what happens here. In the first 20 years of the 1500s, 2 individuals become popes in Rome. All right, their family name is Medici. They were powerful, powerful people, known more than anything else for banking. 2 of them became popes, one almost right after the other. And they knew a whole lot more about banking and money than they did about liturgy and how to run a church. During their time, cardinals and bishops lived like princes. Huge amounts of money were spent on making individual apartments for these people. And the center of the Catholic world at that time, if you were an officer high in the church, you lived like a prince. Now, the reason I chose to do this topic, quite frankly, is that we currently have a pope who doesn't quite see things that way. He won't live here. He lives in a little apartment off by himself. He has set out to reform the church. There was a bishop in Bavaria, for instance, I think a year and a half ago, who had spent well over 300,000 euros on his own private apartments. It all came out of church money. And so there had been, as these things were being built, this sort of undercurrent of anger that this isn't what the church was for. That this gathering up of huge amounts of sums so that a few could live very well in the name of Jesus Christ was just something that a lot of people didn't like very much. If they complained, they were generally rounded up. Few were burned to death, John Huss being one of them. And so no one really dared challenge them. So how did it work? Well, it works like this. The church, because they married people and they buried people, they did communion, they did numbers of other services, they would go to see the sick and take care of them. Gradually it moved from them doing that to them doing that and charging for it. All right? And so you begin to see something that is called the sale of indulgences. Now, I'm sure that some of you have heard about this, but this is the way an indulgence works. If I am a wealthy man and I do something that is wrong, I could purchase an indulgence. It didn't forgive my sin. That was done in confession. It didn't forgive my sin, but it forbade punishment for my sin. And so the way it worked is that if you were wealthy, you could buy one of these, but if you were a poor person who couldn't afford one, then you lived with the sin that you had committed. It appeared as though there were 2 levels of Christianity here, and the Medicis, who really knew how to do this, were collecting lots and lots of money that was coming down from Germany and what is today Holland and Belgium and the rest, and all monies that were coming through and headed for Rome all stopped at their banks in Florence. So they set the bill, they collected the money, and they paid for stuff that they wanted. Now, at this point, you can be seen, when you talk about this, you can be seen as somebody who is preaching an anti-Catholic view. That's just not the case. Every faith on the face of the earth the institutions are run by human beings. Sometimes they forget what it is that they're supposed to be doing. It just happens. And I think that If you remember Jim Baker and Muskegon and some of the evangelist churches that have done some things that are not so good, you can understand that. It just happens. It just happens, and churches have to reform. That's what has to happen. So there was a lot of grumbling, a lot of complaining, but the boot was down on them, and they just didn't choose then to revolt. Go ahead, Nancy. Until this man comes along. It is the only image that we have of Martin Luther. One critic said that when Martin Luther came to see you, his pot belly entered the room, and a few minutes later the rest of them came in. Luther was a monk, all right? Not a priest, he was a monk, which means he lived by a rule. These were called the regula clergy. Regula meaning people who lived by laws. And because they did, they were more respected by commonplace people. Unfortunately, a number of priests and others had become very much corrupt, and they had to be, because the church leadership was telling them that they had to raise money. That was what they had to do. And so a lot of churchmen, seeing that this was the way to do things, did it, and they would keep some for themselves. It had become really, under the Medici popes, it had become a church that was really out of control. It really was. And so Martin Luther, who was a brilliant, absolutely brilliant man, who had the strange occurrence one night while he was walking home to be hit by lightning, changed his view on life, as probably would with all of us. But he realized at that particular point in time that had that bolt of lightning killed him, that he would certainly have gone to hell. That even though he was a monk, he still had desires for things, among them women, that would have damned him for what he was. And so he began to think about that, and to think about what it was to be a human being with all of these thoughts, and yet being required to live a life that was impossible to be. And he asked a very interesting question. What is God's justice? How is it possible that he creates us one way and then asks us to be a different way? To him, it just didn't make any sense. Well, he mulled that over, and the more he thought about it, the more an idea came into his head that the only way then that one achieves heaven, he referred to it as justification by faith. It doesn't have anything to do with what a priest does for you. It doesn't have anything to do with what a church does for you. You are responsible for yourself. You are responsible for the world in which, you're responsible for the way in which you interact with the world. So, Martin Luther did something one day that in those days wasn't considered a big deal at all. He wrote up some stuff to argue about after church. There were no video games in those days, no football games to be played. What people did for entertainment was they would get together after church and argue. And so he had some arguments, and he laid them all out. There were 95 of them. He laid them all out, took them home to the church, at this little church in Wittenberg, and he nailed them to the door. Well, what happened was they were so brilliantly written, and many of them were complaints against the way the church was dealing with people. Now, you have to understand that the people that Luther would have been working with, these people were peasants and farmers. They would not have been educated, all right? They would have been ignorant about most of what went on in the world. They were superstitious, and if the church said they could do something with this magical piece of paper, this indulgence, then they believed it. They believed it. And it was about Luther's time when the sale of a particular kind of indulgence really got everyone excited. If a person was alive and he bought an indulgence, that, as I said, did not remit the crime, but it did stop the punishment. but there was no such rule against somebody who was already dead. So let us say that you have a father that embarrasses you all the time, and you are worried about his soul and where it might go. You could buy an indulgence for a person after he was dead that would guide his way into heaven. And I'm going to give a bad translation of this, but it goes like this. It was said this, that for every coin in the, let me get this wrong, for every coin in the treasury rings, another soul from purgatory springs. Just like that. Well, you might give money for something like that if you thought it might help, your father or your grandfather or your grandmother. You would do this. And so lots and lots of money begin to pour in for the sailing of what were called death indulgences. All right, to take care of it. And really, it was just a way of raising money to pay for the kind of art that I made my living teaching. All right? And so Martin Luther writes these things on the door, not expecting anything to happen from them other than a few people getting around and arguing. And what actually happened was somebody tore them off the door and took them to a place where there was a printing press. The printing press had just been invented by Johann Gutenberg, and all of a sudden these things were being run off and they were all over the place. And Luther finds himself at the head of a revolution that he had no intention of starting. He just wanted the church reformed. The church, papacy, did exactly what they'd done with the others. They invited him to Rome to talk about it. But of course, too many people had been put on fire. And so Luther said, no, I don't think I'm going to go. And his famous statement, here I take my stand. Well, sometimes when you look at all this, the sense is that all of a sudden these protesters, these protestants, from which we get Protestant, all of a sudden just form churches, and now you can see them when you walk, walk around Sault Ste. Marie. There's the Methodists and there's the Presbyterians. It didn't happen that way at all. People just started to worship differently. And one of the first things that they did was to go into any Catholic church that was in their area, tear any painting they could find off the wall, break any statue they could find, any stained glass window they just destroyed. And to this very day, if you go into a Protestant church, for the most part, it has much less decoration than a Catholic church. And if you think about it, if there is one piece of art that you could really call Protestant art, it is that and especially in this time, and now I think it's not quite as prevalent, but if you go into a Catholic church, the image of Christ is on the cross, and we call it a crucifix. We say then that Christ is with us all the time in the person of the priest who is there. He will perform baptism. He will carry you from cradle to grave. He will be there at extreme unction. It is as though Christ is always with you. You go into a Protestant church and there is no crucifix. There is just a cross. The cross says that Christ died once. He died once. He showed you the way. Now your salvation is your own business. That's Luther. All right. Some of the ones that come along a little bit later, John Calvin and Zwingli and the rest, they're a little bit different in their views. But Protestantism sort of starts there. All right. This mixture of ideas. Luther at one point reduced the number of, there are 7 sacraments in the Catholic Church, reduced the number to 5, then reduced the number to 4. Anything that had a priest doing anything for you, he eliminated. All right. Zwingli in Switzerland, who died in fighting for what he believed in his 40s, I believe, he got them down to 2, just 2 sacraments. Men don't need a church to be saved, is the Protestant notion of the time. Go ahead, Nancy. Oh, Luther, this is the prince that protected him, and that man right there is Zwingli, Swiss man who him and Luther met for a little while, seemed to like each other, and then got into a big argument, and that was the end of that. He said something so crude I would not even repeat it here, but it really is very funny. Go ahead.
Later.
And this is a drawing of the stuff that went on outside of churches. You see, the story of Christ and the moneylenders in the Bible, everyone knew it. But this is, people are showing up, some are wealthy, they can, and they're selling and buying, and what they're selling is ways to get out of having to pay for sins that you've committed. It is an amazing little image. So, go ahead, Nance. We get to what I wanted to do. I was hoping that only would take 15 minutes, but it took a little longer. Rembrandt is one of the first painters. Now, the title of this talk is maybe a little lie. There was really no Protestant art. They still made the same things the Catholics did. They just didn't make and festoon their churches quite that way. Rembrandt lived in a Protestant area. It was an area we now call Holland. That area north of France there. Half of it went Catholic. We know that now that's Belgium, all right? And then the rest is Protestant. The Protestants in this area who won their independence allowed religious expression, freedom of religion, sort of, all right? And what happened was that painters like Rembrandt, reading what Luther said, made these religious works, just chose different ones. And at the center of them is the idea of moral choice. The notion that every one of us in our lives, sometime or another, are going to be faced with some terrible ethical problem, something that just tears at us. You have to make a choice, and how you choose defines what you are as a person in the eyes of God. There's nobody that's going to come in and say, come to confession, we can take care of this problem for you. You can be absolved of your sin. Among these early Lutherans and early Protestants, you carried your sins on your back like a sack of rocks for your whole life. So, this absolutely brilliant painting, it's in the Louvre, spectacular thing, is the story that just wasn't painted. It is the story of David and Bathsheba. Now, if you read the Bible, it's going to say less than I'm going to tell you tonight, but by the time that Rembrandt got a hold of this thing, the story had gone a little bit. But it goes like this. King David is walking on the walls of his palace one day and looks down into a garden, not too far from where he is, and he sees Bathsheba bathing in the garden. This was something that was not unusual. People used to bathe outside, but there were always fences and hedges and around so that they couldn't, but he could see down, and he looked down at her, and he immediately fell in love. When I was teaching this to students, the girls always used to shake their head, and the guys understood completely. But at any rate, he would look down, and he saw her. And so he then sent her a message in a note. And as the story evolved, the note wasn't something that was said, it was just a piece of paper. And it essentially, the essential message was, come to the palace and lay with me. That's the message, getting right to the point. At any rate, Bathsheba has this incredible offer. She has just come out of the bath. She's got a servant here who is drying her feet, and now she is faced with this terrible problem. If she goes, she becomes the queen. She becomes a powerful, wealthy person. She's married. Her husband's name is Uriah. And to make it more complicated, Uriah is a soldier in David's army. If she goes, she knows that David will not allow her husband to live. So she balances this incredible moment of moral choice. Do you take the wealth and the power, or do you stay with your husband and remain a poor woman, the wife of a soldier, for the rest of your life? Now, I used to ask my students which way they would go, and it's an astonishing number of them would say, "Oh, I'm going." But again, without much thought. So Rembrandt paints this so that it's a triangle. Can you see it? It starts here, goes up to her face, back down here, and then you have to go back up. And what he wants you to do is focus on her face and focus on this note. She has to choose. And of course, she went. She went. David calls Uriah, who is out fighting, calls her husband to the palace. Not very long after she makes the visit, she tells David that she is with child. David has a real problem now. And so when Uriah arrives, he tells him, go on down. You fought hard. Go on down to your home and spend some time with your wife. The idea being, I guess, is that no one would question where a child would have come from when the husband was away at war. When David comes down in the morning, he finds Uriah sound asleep on the doorstep of the palace. And David says, what are you doing here? I sent you home to be with your wife. And Uriah responds by saying, I am not going to go home and be with my wife when the men that I fight with have no such pleasure. And so, David thinks this over, writes another note, hands it to Uriah. He doesn't even, all he does is fold it over. He knows that Uriah is not going to read it because he is a completely honorable man. And so what ends up happening is that Uriah hands the note to the commander of the army, and the note says, send your forces into fighting, and on a given signal, everybody pulls back except for Uriah. And he is killed. Uriah is dead. One of the things that happens because of a bad moral choice. So Bathsheba goes to the palace and everything seems to be fine, except that there are these characters in the Bible called the judges, and they show up and they accuse David of murder. And he said, I've killed no one. No one. He said, but it is your intent to do that. That is what is important here. David will lose everything. He will be succeeded by a son who is much wiser. His name? Solomon. Solomon the Wise. This is the kind of painting that the Dutch Protestants did. Okay? You won't find this kind of thing in Catholic Italy. You just don't. Go ahead, Nancy. He followed it up with this. This is Samson, the great, powerful man whose strength was in his hair. I understand this painting very well. This is Delilah. She has made a choice. She has seduced him, and while he slept, she cut off his hair, and with it went his strength. And here one of the soldiers drives a pike right into his eye, making him blind. But he isn't the subject of the painting. Delilah is, as she looks back and for a half a second has to think about what it is that she has done. What is the moral choice that she had made, and the disaster that will occur afterwards. This, folks, is the direction that Protestant art went to. You don't find it in Italy because moral choices, whether you make good ones or bad ones, you can be forgiven for what you've done by simply going into a priest and asking for forgiveness. That's not the case here. Go ahead, Nancy. There is another curious byproduct of the Protestant Revolution. If what you are being asked to do is to study yourself. You want to understand your life as it's evolving and the choices that you're making. And so some artists, some Dutch artists especially, begin to do lots of self-portraits. There are, I think, over 60 of Rembrandt's in paint and the rest. Here he was as a young guy. He was in the bars having a wonderful time, and he just really looks happy. All right? But as he got older, the circumstances in Holland failed. All right? The art market collapsed, for one thing, and he couldn't sell his paintings anymore. And at one point in time, we know that he traded 2 paintings that I think are both now in the Louvre for a cow. So he would have milk. All right? Go ahead, Nancy. And so he became a respectable, successful artist for a while, and here you see him in nice clothing, and everything's looking good. Go ahead, Nancy. And then he got a little older, and he just kept getting older. Go ahead. And he changed. You know, his first wife that he just absolutely loved dearly, she had died. He was a terrible manager of money, and he began to look at his life as a failure. You know, one of the artists that we think is one of the greatest that ever lived. Go ahead, Nancy. And then this kind of wonderful last painting that he did of himself when he was close to death. And there's a sort of resignation here. You know, that he had lived his life, he had made this choice and this was good, and he made that choice and it wasn't. But he had lived out his life and he had done what he could, and that's it. You don't see artists in Italy doing 50 or 60 self-portraits. About 200 years later, there will be another Dutchman that will come along and do exactly the same thing. Any of you know his name? Vincent van Gogh. Vincent van Gogh. Go ahead. Here is another. I threw this in because I thought there might be a couple of science guys here tonight. But remember how Galileo was treated in Italy? When he refused to abide by church doctrine? They strapped him down on a table and they caned his feet. They beat his feet so badly that he could hardly walk, broke all of the bones in his feet, and finally Galileo just threw up his arms and recanted, and that was it. But this is a free place. And here you have Dr. Nicholas Tulp was his name. And this was the kind of painting that was oftentimes done at this time. Doctors would invite a painter in. When the man became the head of the local medical service, the local medical college, he would give a lecture. And here you see a dead body. All right, in Italy, if you did this kind of thing, you would be arrested. It ran counter to church doctrine. Robbing graves, dealing with corpses, just was not something that was done. But here you see the other doctors are looking very close as he gives his lecture on how the arms work and all the rest. Science in Protestant countries advanced much more rapidly because of this freedom to be able to do the kind of things then that they kind of exploration that they wanted to do. Go ahead, Nancy. Here's another. Keep going. So then we get, after Rembrandt, we come to the second great painter, Holland. This time, he's a younger man. His name is Jan Vermeer. He's a fascinating guy. How many of you have read the book, The Girl with the Pearl Eardrop? How many of you have read that? A nice story. Actually, she was a Turkish girl they ran into on the docks. It's a great story, though. Look at this thing. Vermeer has a special vantage point that Rembrandt didn't have, because Vermeer was raised a Protestant under the teachings of John Calvin. And when he got married, his wife was Catholic, and so he switched and became a Catholic. So he had a look at both sides. But he does this painting of a woman in very prosperous Holland who is weighing pearls, except that she isn't. She isn't weighing pearls. They have taken microscopes and analyzed the dishes of these two balances. There's nothing in them. If you look up behind her, there is a painting on the wall of the Last Judgment, where Christ is weighing souls. Right in front of her here is a mirror that she has to look into every day. So she could use her position to cheat people if she wanted to. She could do that. But the moral choice is hers. Her salvation depends on how she lives her life. The moral choices, and here she holds a balance that puts up against Christ's balance up there, and she looks in the mirror just as Rembrandt would have looked at one of his own self-portraits, and she knows what she is at that particular point in her life. So what happens if she needs money? Well, maybe she does something else. But right now, she's very calm, she's very assured, and she knows what she is. Go ahead, Nancy. Now you might say, how did this thing work its way in? This is a house of pleasure. Anybody here been to Amsterdam? So then, well, if you take a walk in Amsterdam, just let me tell you that you're going to see things that you will never see again in your life. But here is this moment when the soldier has made his choice. He is paying the greedy madam right here. The money is going to go from this hand into that hand very, very quickly, and then what is ever paid for then is then collected. The thing is that right over there in the corner, that's Vermeer, and he's toasting them. You see, the great thing about real freedom of religion is that you have the right to be stupid and to be sinful and to be corrupt. That's the wonderful thing about it. And so he is in this house, as he apparently often was. He holds the drink up, he looks out at the people who are out there, he gives them a big smile. And of course, I think that if you were to talk to any priest or minister in this town and you ask them, does religion allow you the right to do stupid things with your life if you want? They'd say, of course it does. We are here to help you try to avoid those kind of pitfalls. And so, this kind of painting, never done in Italy, never done in the Catholic countries. Go ahead. And for the science guys, for the Denny Dohertys of this world, two paintings, one right after another. The Dutch, of course, were sending out ships. Some of them actually went to New York. They were a very, very prosperous country, and they had a big navy, and they were interested in wealth wherever they could find it. But people would go, and then they would come back, and they would say, well, how did you get there? And they'd say, well, I don't know, I just got to sail around. And they'd say, well, could you draw something? And so, in fact, then, they would be brought back to artists who would then have to take these captain's scrawlings and try to figure out just exactly where the geography was. All right? This is the birth of the science of geography, at least in the Renaissance at this time. And here you see this guy, you can tell he's just deep in thought. He's just trying to figure it out. And he's got a compass here, and he's trying to work it through. He's got stuff lying on the floor, and in the background, one of his maps. And up there, a globe. You see, we're in the Italian South, they're still arguing that the earth is flat. They're still making the arguments that the world as it is described for thousands of years in Catholic doctrine was that way. And of course, the scientists were just showing that just wasn't true. You were free to practice your science in Protestant Holland. We know now that this young fellow right here was a scientist. All right, he was a friend of Vermeer's, and he posed for this image. Go ahead, Nance. And if you look, it's the same room, right? It's the same guy. The Nazis got this one in the Second World War. It disappeared for a long time, and it has been recovered, and they're trying to get the two. They were supposed to hang together. But this fellow, he isn't working on geography. If you look, these are star clusters here. He's an astronomer. He's looking up into the night sky, and he's trying to figure out just exactly then where things are. Scientists, free to work out what they want to do. And by the way, when Vermeer became a Catholic, nobody made a big deal out of it. There were a lot of Catholics in Protestant Holland. They just worshiped separately. Rembrandt spent a great deal of his time in the Jewish quarter, like those people. Go ahead. Do you see what's up there? It's a gentleman who has come to visit a lady, but look up above. Do you see things? There's Africa. It's a very, very crude and primitive map. But this is what they were doing. This is what they were going with. Go ahead, Nancy. Oh, and I thought this last thing here. There is, how many of you have been to Holland, Michigan, down in that area? Well, have you noticed that it's really clean? That you're up to your lower lip in tulips for the most part, and you wander around, but all the houses are very street. There is this notion that comes out of Protestantism that goes something like this: the cleanliness of your home speaks to the cleanliness of your soul. And so what you begin to see, and if you go through Holland, all these little nice little houses and everything ship-shape. For those of us who have wandered around Italy, that's just not the way it is. And so one image, and this is a Vermeer, it's called the Love Letter, but one thing that will appear in lots of paintings at this time is a broom. They put brooms in their paintings, and the idea was then that if a woman had a broom in her home, that indicated then that she was concerned about how her place looked, and it spoke then to the cleanliness of her soul. Go ahead. The view of Delft, one of these images, everything's all neat and clean and everything like this. But the broom over in the corner. Boy, that's one we've let go, eh? Who cares about that anymore? Go ahead, Nancy. I don't know. That might be the end of it all. Yes, it is. So, the art of the Protestants. Questions?
May I ask, roughly physically, is an average size for most of those, are some huge and some pictures smaller physically?
Smaller. Smaller, right. Remember that if you were an artist working in Rome, you made a work to fit a space in a church. So if it was a huge wall, you'd make a big painting. If you were living in Holland, the church didn't pay for art. Local people did. It went in their homes, and so the stuff would be smaller. Vermeer also used a scientific instrument to actually, the camera obscura, it's called. It's a way of using a mirror to actually copy something that you see it shines on the wall. And everybody criticizes him for it, the great master using a trick. But Vermeer, if he was standing here, he would have said, I'm an artist. I make money, I sell things. However you made it was what, but the answer to your question is smaller.
Okay.
Smaller. Yeah.
I'm interested in knowing between the Protestant and the Catholics there, if a Catholic can go to confession and have their sins absolved, and a Protestant has no way to have their sins absolved, then if they don't make a good choice, they're not going to heaven.
Luther said that good deeds didn't count. That what counted were the moral choices you made in your life. I always thought that it was a lot harder to be a Lutheran than it was to be a Catholic, because the demands are that you must. There is no way to avoid a sin once you've done it. Whereas with a Catholic, you can go to confession and you know, so you see this as unfair?
Yes.
Well,
No, I really do. It's just, like I said, why wouldn't you want to be Catholic then? I'd want to be Catholic. So, yeah.
Debbie, if this helps, when the church was being formed almost 1,000 years before, there were a lot of people that were just lost. And Pope Gregory the Great, who sort of put the sacraments of baptism, these things kind of been around, but he is the one that gives form to the church. And he creates what he called the seven-step ladder to salvation. And the idea was this wall of sin that the ordinary person couldn't get over it, just couldn't get over it. So you have baptism, communion, holy orders, all the seven. And each one of them allows you to get a little higher and over on the other side. Gregory did this so to bring comfort to his people, to show that there was a better life coming if you could just do this. The problem is, like all good systems, it became corrupted over the years, and money becomes the corrupter. I'll do this for you, but this is what it's going to cost. If you want your dad to go to heaven, you throw in this, and you know. And so that's just the way it is. In some instances, people were actually buried with lots of letters of indulgences just in case, you know, it slipped by. Additional questions? Anything? You're here for the food, I can tell that. Folks, it's beyond our study here, but of course, once you get to these people who are making maps and studying the sky and doing that, it isn't going to be too long before you start to see real scientists who are doing things by a scientific method, and eventually, and you're not too far here, away from Isaac Newton, who, of course, brilliant man who changed the world. Anything else? Jeff?
Where's the timeline of all this in comparison to the Inquisition?
No. The Inquisition is beyond the scope of this, but Luther put his 95 Theses on the wall in 1517. All right? It becomes, the church can't collect taxes from these people anymore, so Catholic armies sweep up into the north and they try to put these people down. The French, a lot of French Protestants that we call Huguenots, were murdered for their beliefs. But that's in 1517. After a while, the real strong center of the Catholic Church, a militant center, is in Spain. There, the Spanish will develop a system by which they will send out the soldiers of Christ, the Jesuits. They will send them out to deal with this. And what ends up happening is that the Jesuits are such that the Inquisition and the trial that you had to go through, and they always found you guilty, and they always burned you to death because that freed your spirit from sin. These are the terrific guys. But think about what happens next, because it has to do a lot to do with Sault Ste. Marie and places like St. Augustine, Florida. The Jesuits scared people. They terrified people. Luther did his thing in 1517. All right. Columbus had discovered the so-called New World in 1492. A lot of people fled. Pilgrims fled too.
They went to Holland from England.
Right. But also, you have people going to Pennsylvania. You have people moving to the New World where they can pretty much worship as they want. And I don't know, for a few old-timers that are in this audience, you may remember that when Richard Nixon ran for president against John Kennedy, the first Catholic president, that Nixon made the joke one night that if, you know, that he's building birdhouses in Washington where all the cardinals will live. You know, it's just, Nixon wasn't really good at telling a joke. But, you know, that was a really, really big deal. Okay? The Inquisition goes through the 1540s, 1550s, 1560s, and on. They chase them out. All right, a lot of Protestants just run. They have no armies, you know, they can't fight back. They tended to go into North America The Jesuits, the Spanish that came after them, did too, but made their way down into Florida where they discovered something far more interesting than a few straggling Protestants. They found gold and silver. They found the Aztecs, and they found, and what's the date for the Sioux?
1668.
Okay, St. Augustine is older, and there's one other that's older. All right, but these were places where you went to get away from religious persecution. Questions? Yes.
Martin Luther, what happened to him after
He lived, I think, until about the age of 54 or 55. He stayed in what is today Germany, and he stayed alive. And he wrote things and had arguments with other churchmen. John Calvin, who is really the second generation of Protestants, came along after him, much stricter. We have Calvin College down here. We have but nobody pays attention to the fact that when John Calvin ran into people that did not, Protestant people, who did not adhere to his line, he had over 70 people executed. Like I said, in religions are run by human beings, and they make mistakes and they do things sometimes. I mean, our world is torn apart by religion right now. And so it probably will be for a while. Any other questions? Yes?
You kind of asked it earlier. The representation of the Last Supper, the faces that are there, is there any historic significance that, and we know that supposedly what Jesus looked like, but the other individuals that are in there, do they
know what they look like?
Yes.
Only one. Well, maybe two. John here, who was very, very young. And by the way, for those of you who've read the Da Vinci Codes, this is great straight. But he was a young boy, always portrayed John in any painting done at this time as a little effeminate, looking a little bit like a woman. That was to show his age. And because they would stay up late, he would always fall asleep. And usually he fell asleep right here or right here. But Da Vinci wanted this glare from Judas right here to Christ, not to have anybody in the way. And this is not a particularly good image here, but Judas had red hair, and the hair that he painted is a little red. Questions? Well, thank you for coming, folks. I appreciate it.